This is a part 2 video essay expanding on my original video here, but to summarize that video, in it I showcased every update and major change Elden Ring has had since it released, and I compared its design philosophy to its achievement data within a 6-month time frame, and how I believe the game has not entirely succeeded in its design as most might think. This was a result of the high number of players that don't have any achievements related to any of the game's endings. While Elden Ring has become more accessible to a new audience and has obtained the largest audience out of almost every Dark Souls game combined so far, there are a ton of factors why players haven't completed the game yet. So I want to show a brief history of Dark Souls as a genre, how each game's design is affected by said history, and highlighting why Elden Ring's completion data is so low compared to previous Souls games. I lightly brushed on these topics in my last video, which was my first time ever using this video essay format, and I received a lot of positive feedback to my surprise, so thanks for that. But I also wanted to acknowledge a lot of the valid critiques and some of the criticism I received as well to improve this format, especially if it's something you all enjoy. So please leave a like and subscribe, because we are extremely close to 100,000 subscribers here on this channel. Anyways, a lot of comments suggested that my previous video felt a little too narrow in scope, because while I looked at the data from Elden Ring's player base and compared that to itself, I neglected to fully highlight and explain myself as to why I didn't compare it to previous Souls games, which is completely valid, and we're gonna dive into that. But first, ad time. This video is sponsored by Raid Shadow Legends. This game recently got a pretty cool update and added tons of new content, and it's a completely free-to-play mobile game with over 600 champions. Each champion comes from a unique faction with their own history and lore. Some of my favorite champions come from the High Elves. In the High Elves faction, we got people like the Jingle Hunter, the Avenger who has an amazing personality, and Vergus who looks badass, so keep him in mind because we'll come back to him later. The High Elves backstory is pretty dope too. Their homeland Aravia survived for thousands of years. They helped the humans form into civilizations and even fended off a massive horde of orcs who ransacked their continent. Things were looking great for the High Elves, but it got a little twisted when Sarath, the Lord of Darkness, brainwashed a bunch of the High Elves and turned them evil, forcing them to attack each other and destroy their own kingdom. This civil war nearly ended the elves entirely, but Aravia held on, rebuilding after the fall, and now it's stronger than ever. So what's new in Raid? This month had a huge update, as I mentioned earlier, introducing a brand new faction known as the Sylvian Watchers, featuring some amazing new champions. This includes the Forest Elves, Ents, Druids, and Fays that are all here and can't wait to be summoned. On top of these new heroes, they have a large lineup of events coming along with the new season that includes the Forge Pass, where you can get your hands on some of the most powerful gear in the entire game so far. Also, if you're an Amazon Prime member, you can get your exclusive rewards in Raid right now. This is the best time to get started and try out Raid, and if you click my links in the description or scan the QR code here on the screen, you get additional unique bonuses worth $30 in value. These free rewards are only available for new players and will expire if you don't redeem them within the next 30 days. And hey, remember that really cool looking champion Vergus I mentioned earlier? He's a part of the unique bonuses which unlocks him for you for free, as well as 200,000 silver, 1 energy refill, 1 XP boost, and 1 ancient shard, allowing you to summon for other new champions as soon as you get in game. All of this will be waiting for you to collect here at the top of your screen. Just remember to click the links located in the description, and I'll see you in the game. Okay, this is not an Elden Ring hate video. I absolutely love this game. I have over 1,000 hours in it and patiently waited more than 3 years for this game to come out. Elden Ring is objectively a great game, but I wanted to do some more overanalyzing of video games because I don't touch grass. So let's start off with a quote from Miyazaki 1 month before Elden Ring released, January 28th, 2022. In Elden Ring, we have not intentionally tried to lower the game's difficulty, but I think more players will finish it this time. The player has more agency to dictate their approach against, for example, the field bosses in the overworld and how they utilize stealth in various situations. We've even reduced the number of hoops that you have to jump through to enjoy it in multiplayer. So we hope the players embrace that idea of receiving help from others, and we feel like the overall clear rate will go up this time because of these things. Now, the reason I didn't initially compare Elden Ring's completion rate to other Souls games directly is because other games have had years for the player base to complete them or weren't designed to be as accessible like Elden Ring is, and tons of other reasons. But as of right now, Elden Ring has the lowest clear rate when compared to other Souls games. These are all the achievements related to beating the game for every Souls title. Unfortunately, Bloodborne and Demon Souls are outliers on this list since they're the only games exclusive to a single system, as well as PlayStation not keeping track of offline data. But anyways, to truly understand completion rates, we need to look at the development history of the Souls series, which goes really far back in time. Here's a timeline of Dark Souls and its creator Hidetaka Miyazaki. Follow along because it'll all make sense later as to why I went over it. Now, if we look at this timeline of events, Miyazaki grew up loving the manga Berserk, which he stated to have read during his college years. This was an especially crucial piece of literature that ignited his desire to make a game featuring similar dark fantasy themes, as well as being inspired by RPG games like Kingsfield and Ico, and Western literature as a whole from people like George R.R. Martin specifically. Around 2005, Miyazaki quits his main job and joins the From Software development team to work on an Armored Core game as a planner. After a year, he is promoted to work as director director for the 4th installment of the Armored Core series. This game featured nationwide success in Japan but had an average reception overseas. This local success promoted Miyazaki to a director position within From Software, enabling him to create his passion project known as Demon Souls. This game was designed to be challenging and hit a niche market that even FromSoft knew would not sell well, but also allowing Miyazaki to express himself creatively for the first time, which is something that he likes doing a lot, as you will soon find out. But luckily, it achieved international success and sold almost triple what its American publisher Altus had estimated it would sell, selling 250 copies in America alone after almost a year, with no mass marketing, released by a small name publisher with a relatively unknown development team, and it was also a completely new intellectual property, so not anticipated as a sequel or franchise. It wasn't a record-breaking success by any means, but it was definitely a notable success for the companies who expected it to be a complete failure before it released. Fast forward, with the unlikely success of Demon Souls, From Software was picked up by Bandai Namco as their publisher, which allowed Miyazaki to creatively express himself again, fully fleshing out his idealized settings and thematics with Dark Souls 1. This game was another hit with Western audiences, and with its success gave FromSoft more funding and allowed Miyazaki to focus on another project, which is a reoccurring cycle here. However, this is now around 2012-2013 when Sony reached out to Miyazaki to secure a deal. They would offer a large sum of money to fund his next project, whichever it may be, in exchange for exclusivity rights for their next-gen consoles, which at the time was the PlayStation 4. Of course, Miyazaki jumped at this because more funding meant more resources to express his ideas to their fullest extent. But after the major success of the first Dark Souls game, Bandai Namco really wanted a sequel to it, so this allowed a man named Tomohiro Shibuya to take over as the director of Dark Souls 2. In this time, Miyazaki set his full focus on developing a game that most of you probably haven't heard of. The entire development process of Dark Souls 2 was pretty dreadful without Miyazaki, and Matt makes a really good video about it here that I highly recommend checking out for a very detailed list as to what happened, what went wrong, and why Dark Souls 2 is so different from every other Souls game. But to summarize that video, Bandai Namco felt Tomohiro Shibuya was creating his version of Dark Souls, but that version strayed too far from what they believed a sequel to Dark Souls should be, so he was eventually replaced by Yui Tanamura to essentially clean up his mess and make the game feel more like Dark Souls 1 again, pretty much having to change everything with a very strict schedule and a year to release. Tanamura was a good guy who did his best with what he was given. He also went on to help direct Dark Souls 3 and even Elden Ring with Miyazaki, so if there's anyone that should take any blame, it's on Shibuya over here. One of the most notable things under Yuri Tanamura's direction involved constraining the levels, making them feel more linear again and less open-worldy as they initially were. Wait a minute. Massive open world, introducing a cool mechanic known as power stancing, a ton of different bosses in a game with countless overpowered weapons and spells? Sound familiar? But anyways, Miyazaki didn't touch Dark Souls 2 at all during its development process because he didn't want to disturb their progress and also didn't have time to direct 2 different games at once, since he already had his hands full with Bloodborne, which was being developed in tandem with Sony Japan at the same time as Dark Souls 2. But this was fine because Bloodborne became the biggest hit yet and sort of overshadowed Dark Souls 2 as a whole, sitting at the 21st most sold PlayStation 4 game of all time. Later, Dark Souls 3 released in 2016, and Dark Souls 3 is actually more of a Dark Souls 2 than Dark Souls 2 in the sense that it's a direct sequel from Miyazaki to the first original Dark Souls. That might sound confusing, but aside from subtle nods to Dark Souls 2 here and there, the story and setting of Dark Souls 3 has nothing to do with Dark Souls 2 at all. Instead, Dark Souls 3 takes place around 5,000 years after the events of the first Dark Souls game, which is a true direct sequel to the original Dark Souls, skipping over and ignoring the events of Dark Souls 2 completely. But Miyazaki hated making sequels. He stated on record that he would rather make new projects with fresh ideas. He made Dark Souls 3 as a direct sequel to appease his devoted cult-like audience who desperately wanted a legitimate successor to the first game, and also given the poor reception of Dark Souls 2, he made Dark Souls 3 under the notion that it would be the last Dark Souls game ever because again, he enjoys doing new stuff for every project. Speaking of new stuff, Sekiro was the next new stuff that was released in 2019, but other new stuff known as Elden Ring actually started its development around the same time as Sekiro. Elden Ring's development started very shortly after Dark Souls 3 released, which puts Elden Ring in development for an estimate of 6 years. As far as the Souls history goes, this is a good enough amount of background information to set the stage and focus on what separates each game from each other. So let's start off with Demon Souls. Demon Souls was essentially the blueprint Miyazaki created with less of a focus on aesthetics and graphics and putting most of the efforts into the unique design of its gameplay and exploration over anything else. This project was initially an untitled fantasy game that was failing in development at From Software already and was close to being cancelled entirely. However, this was just the thing Miyazaki wanted to work on because the game was doomed before he joined, so it didn't really matter what direction the game went in. He later joined the team, taking over as director halfway through, and he restarted development from the ground up as everyone expected it to be a failure anyways, to which he stated, "Best of all, if my ideas failed, nobody would care. It was already a failure." The only thing he didn't change was the initial concept of a medieval fantasy setting because he was already a massive Westaboo. It's like the complete inverse of a weeaboo. Here we see Miyazaki build the foundations of what makes Dark Souls Dark Souls. Demon Souls was not meant to be fair, featuring a very steep learning curve that would satisfy a small and niche audience. Miyazaki wanted to make the game hard and brought out his inner sadist. It didn't matter if the game was too hard for some people because again, the game was already set to fail from the start. I also find it funny that people praise Miyazaki for creating the most challenging yet fair and rewarding games of the genre, because it didn't start out that way with Demon's Souls. Miyazaki enjoys fucking with people. He initially wanted a permadeath system in Demon's Souls where you had one go to get as far as you could, and dying would delete your save data. But eventually, he ended up getting talked out of it, and actually had to hide how difficult the game was from the publishers. Despite the egregious learning curve, or should I say learning mountain, it provided a unique experience unlike anything else, which surged with Western audiences. It allowed players to play however they chose, tying the difficulty of the game to the strength of your character's gear and stats. The singular steep difficulty would put all players on the same playing field, banding together a niche player base that appreciated the no hand-holding and unforgiving gameplay to figure out how to beat this incredibly difficult game that throws you in with little to no guidance. Mechanics such as parrying and backstabbing were introduced here as well, providing extra depth towards combat besides spamming the main attack buttons. Defensive mechanics like blocking was what most players defaulted to, but the introduction of dodge rolling gave the player some breathing room and of course iframes to dodge attacks. The timing for a successful dodge rewarded skill expression for players that invested more time into perfecting those mechanics. The layouts of the levels were also linear yet dense, meaning that typically a player would start a level and have to complete an area boss to progress to the next section, but on their journey they would find shortcuts that lead right back to the beginning or previous checkpoints. The most unique aspect of the series featured the multiplayer system, allowing players to leave messages for each other, and the invasion system here for the first time, summoning and battling other players, allowing them to interrupt your session or vice versa. Essentially, the first Dark Souls game was the spiritual successor to Demon's Souls in almost every way. Due to the surprise success with Western audiences, Bandai Namco picked up the publishing rights to help From Software create another game of the same design, but without the initial failure from the start and a more supportive outlook on the franchise's potential. Miyazaki had already laid the groundwork for the first Dark Souls game within Demon's Souls, even reusing some designs on previous levels and bosses as well as other assets. This fresh start from Miyazaki allowed him to flesh out more detail and depth from his initial concepts, polishing and expanding on everything that he started on from Demon's Souls. Dark Souls focused on creating more iconic bosses, memorable characters, world building, and visual storytelling, which led to a massive success for the company yet again. Now, because of the groundbreaking success for the original Dark Souls, Bandai Namco wanted a sequel as fast as possible, but Miyazaki was busy at the time making the Artorias DLC for the first game, so they got someone else in the From Software staff to direct the sequel. As Miyazaki finished up the Artorias DLC, he was approached by Sony, who wanted an exclusive title that utilized their next-gen PlayStation 4 technology. Since we already talked about Dark Souls 2 earlier, let's focus more on Bloodborne for now and what Miyazaki was doing there. Instead of making a sequel to his own game, Miyazaki let someone else take charge completely, because he had more resources from Sony to really push his creative limits to their fullest. He also enjoys messing around with new ideas instead of staying within the boundaries of what is expected from a sequel. This prompted the first shift in gameplay, because while Bloodborne did keep similar aspects of Dark Souls and Demon's Souls, Miyazaki could focus on both the gameplay and the aesthetics together for the first time, which made the gameplay the exact opposite of pretty much every Dark Souls game. However, to make this work, the game was a bit more limiting when it came to weapons, introducing less quantity and more quality, totaling only 15 non-DLC weapons, as opposed to Demon's Souls 78, Dark Souls 130, Dark Souls 2 202, Dark Souls 3 191, and Elden Ring's 309 unique weapons. These 15 weapons were known as trick weapons, which had a base weapon that featured little gimmicks to alter their attack patterns. The players were faster and became more aggressive, but so did the bosses, completely shifting the pace of combat. Dark Souls combat featured slower pace and strategic gameplay with bulky bosses that attack slow, leaving wide open windows that the player could easily punish. Bloodborne completely reshaped what a boss fight really meant to the franchise, introducing high risk, high reward, fast-paced gameplay where bosses could now rush the player and denied the player defensive options like blocking, but in exchange gave the player more offensive options like a parry pistol that could stagger enemies, leaving them vulnerable to riposte for critical strikes. And since there were less physically defensive options, Bloodborne invented a new combat mechanic called Rally, which better suited aggressive gameplay, because now whenever you lost health, you had a few seconds of a grace period where you can earn your health back by beating the shit out of whatever made you lose it. In Dark Souls, it's common for people to panic roll or hide behind shields once they get hit and run far away until they can chug a pot. The core gameplay of Bloodborne rewarded players for staying close to the boss in a sort of waltz by dancing around each other, giving the player an incentive to not completely run away. Dark Souls and Demon's Souls were mostly comprised of, well, demons and monsters. Of course, the games had some humanoid bosses and enemies, but Bloodborne really put an emphasis on human-type bosses like Lady Maria and Gurman. These specific bosses set the player up against an enemy who shared the exact same set of tools as the player. They were easily staggered with low poise and could be parried, but could also parry the player in exchange. They even had the same trick weapons as the player and also tried to dodge your attacks, emphasizing that bosses could be agile and floaty, unlike the larger damage sponge type enemies that made up a majority of bosses in previous games. Dark Souls 3 would act as a culmination of the best pieces of each game, from hardcore gameplay to beautiful aesthetics, level design, memorable characters, and dynamic combat at a much faster pace, which was the first time this type of gameplay was introduced to a mainline Dark Souls title. The gameplay of Dark Souls 3 became the most aggressive Dark Souls yet, with bosses like the Abyss Watchers, Champion Gundyr, Pontiff, Nameless King, Sister Freed, and Slave Knight Gale to name a few, creating some of the most intense boss fights the series has seen so far. Bosses were no longer waiting for you to hit them and felt more responsive to the player's actions. They wanted to capture the essence of what players loved about the original Dark Souls and Demon Souls, and at this point became their most sold game to date. It also helped put the series to rest by adding an actual ending to the Dark Souls storyline with the Ring City DLC, but leaving the door open just a crack, a true love letter to the fanbase. It seems like Miyazaki made this more for the fans and less for himself. Dark Souls 3 brought a perfect balance of difficulty and fairness, setting the tone that Dark Souls games were about accomplishment by overcoming tremendous odds, as Miyazaki puts it. So let's do a quick little recap. Demon Souls focused mainly on its gameplay. The first Dark Souls focused mostly on the aesthetics and story. Dark Souls 2 focused mostly on its open world. Bloodborne focused on faster paced combat and more intense boss fights. And Dark Souls 3 was the same feel as Dark Souls 1, but improving on all aspects learned so far and acting as a true sequel and cinematic final chapter for the mainline Dark Souls titles. So where does that leave Sekiro? Well, most people focus on Sekiro's combat and narrative, given that these were the two strongest points the game brought to the table. However, I find that the most overlooked aspect of Sekiro was a major lesson in accessibility for Miyazaki. Ever notice that all Dark Souls games were published by Bandai Namco? Sekiro was actually picked up by Activision, of all things, to become a publisher for Miyazaki's next game. So why Activision? Well, there's a pretty good reason. Miyazaki knew how to make challenging games, but eager to learn, Miyazaki wanted to challenge himself by not making his games easier, but making them more accessible, and to do this, he needed the help of Activision. Miyazaki stated that Activision was the best fit for a publisher because they help with Sekiro's accessibility, such as helping with tutorials and acknowledging that we're not particularly strong in those areas, as well as additional features like skill trees and crafting systems. The publishers focus on helping Miyazaki add an ease of play and comfort to the Dark Souls formula, which is why he outsourced for Activision specifically. It also helped that Activision promised Miyazaki complete creative freedom and allowed him full control of Sekiro, but left themselves available as a resource whenever he needed guidance. This is why Miyazaki chose to work with Activision, helping FromSoft learn the most important lessons before creating Elden Ring. Now, after all that history, here we are, finally at the time of Elden Ring. As I previously mentioned, this game was in development for 6 years, the longest development out of any game developed by From Software. Elden Ring became the absolute pinnacle of everything Miyazaki has learned, going back to his roots with the original Dark Souls formula, but including the highest level of accessibility ever offered to the players in a Souls game. You'll hear me throw around the word accessibility a lot, but I don't mean something like colorblindness settings or subtitles. Because while those are good features, I'm talking about accessibility in the sense that a new player could pick up and beat Elden Ring without having the knowledge of Dark Souls as a formula. Accessibility doesn't mean making the game easier by dumbing down bosses or enemies, but rather allowing the player more freedom in how they approach adversity. So going back to the quote and completion rates I showed at the start of this video, these are the achievements from every Souls game. Players earn these achievements by completing their respective games, or at least the most achieved ending for each game. Now, initially, completion rates of games can vary for a ton of reasons. Just going through the history of each game can show you how the development issues or lack of accessibility impacts the player base in general. So when looking at a game like Demon Souls or Bloodborne, for example, both of these games are outliers as they are the only PlayStation exclusive games on this list, giving them both lower play rates and in turn lower completion rates, and not counting completion data from those that play without an internet connection. As for Demon Souls, its low completion rate could be attributed to its initial development being set on failure. This is the data from the original Demon Souls for the PS3 as well, not the remake. So having a completion rate of 20.5% is low, but honestly pretty solid. This game was not designed to be fair, at least when compared to other Souls games. It featured an emphasis on difficulty and challenging gameplay that only a few hardcore gamers would actually invest the time into completing. This was also a long time ago. I'm talking the ancient years of 2009. It's hard to understand how spoiled we are with the limitless resources for guides and information currently, but back then you couldn't just go on YouTube and type best most OP Demon Souls builds to find the best agreed upon ways to beat the game with ease. 2009 was a primitive wasteland. Your best tools for success were text-based forums and gaming magazines or guidebooks, which a majority of these were still pretty bad. But without that, Demon Souls was a completely blind playthrough for most. We saw a substantial increase in completion rates with the first Dark Souls game at 27.8%, but again, this was the original, not the remaster. The first Dark Souls game became more about overcoming adversity and shifted to a challenging yet fair state of gameplay that we all know and love. Dark Souls still remained pretty difficult and punishing, but it felt more like it was your fault when things went wrong and less about the game being unfair. It also included some very overpowered magic builds, and coincidentally making mostly every boss weak to magic allowed players safer and easier methods of gameplay. But of course, using the Zweihander from start to finish was also a valid option too. This increase in completion rate is attributed to the golden age of the internet circa 2012, where a ton more players were making resources and guides on YouTube, and the visual clarity with physical walkthroughs started becoming more relevant. Again, Dark Souls was still in its niche, and while it was more accessible than Demon's Souls, it was kind of like saying flying an airplane is easier than flying a helicopter to someone that doesn't even have a driver's license. It's largely thanks to the internet for its increase in accessibility because, man, trying to figure out how to make a mage build without going through any of these resources was likely impossible for the average player. Dark Souls 2 has shockingly the highest completion percentage out of every game, but how? Wasn't Dark Souls 2 a development failure? Plus, didn't everyone hate how different Dark Souls 2 felt from every other game? Well, not entirely. While the game had the worst development process since Demon's Souls, it actually did a lot of really cool things. It was the first time Dark Souls saw a world that wasn't completely linear, meaning the players could go wherever they want. If one specific area was harder for someone, they could try a different area, gain some levels there, and then come back to get past where they got stuck. There were tons of bosses and tons more ways to gain souls and by extent levels, making you way stronger and over-leveled without really trying. Seriously, over-leveling was such a common problem that FromSoft had to add an item that prevented the player from gaining souls entirely. Oh yeah, life gems were also a thing. So while Dark Souls games typically limit your healing to Estus flasks and spells, Dark Souls 2 had all of that, but also a limitless supply of healing in this game. Most players also found things like rolling or hitboxes annoying in this game, but that came from the lack of understanding for the adaptability stat, which was a stat that made your dodge rolls have more iframes. Without leveling adaptability, base rolling was pretty awful, and it also affected the rate of how fast you could sip your bottle of Sunny D, letting you heal faster or slower depending on how much of it you had. Players that realized putting points into the stat early was extremely rewarding, and combined with overpowered weapons that could be power stanced, which was the best feature to come from this franchise, and even stronger spells than Dark Souls 1 but still with no mana cost. It's easy to see how Dark Souls 2 was the highest completed Dark Souls game in the franchise's history. There was also a very dense amount of guides and resources for this game compared to Demon's Souls and the first Dark Souls. The areas in which this game truly suffered in development was that most of the bosses felt very bare in quality and scattered around in quantity. For example, the Royal Rat Vanguard or Demon of Song and Prowling Magnus and Congregation, to name a few. This became another reason for this game having such a marginal increase in completion rates. Most of the bosses were very underwhelming and almost laughably easy compared to what Dark Souls bosses are known for. They had very few attacks and were pretty boring in both design and gameplay. A lot of the actual difficult bosses also had gimmicks that made them even easier. The Lost Sinner would have been a hard fight in complete darkness as intended, but you could just turn on the lights and it was a cakewalk. Same with Mytha, the Baneful Queen. A boss fight where the player is knee-deep in a poison swamp seems pretty difficult, but all the poison could be drained by setting the windmill on fire, making the fight trivial. Even one of my personal favorite bosses, the Looking Glass Knight, was a boss that could summon real-life players to team up with and kick your ass in the middle of a boss fight. But again, it couldn't do this offline and was still tied to soul memory, which locks most players out of what otherwise would have been a really unique boss fight. So I believe Dark Souls 2 to be the easiest Souls game so far. It's still fun, but comparing its completion rates to Dark Souls 3, you can see a massive drop in completion rates again. Once Miyazaki was done making Bloodborne, he took all he learned about what truly makes a boss fight terrifying and returned to the roots of the original yet much harder Dark Souls formula. Dark Souls 3 now put more of a limit on leveling, making it harder to become overleveled. Any OP spells or castings now had the player choose between red or blue flasks to restore their FP, resulting in far less healing and far less damage output if you wanted to be any sort of caster compared to previous games, where casting spells only cost stamina that would quickly regenerate. Dark Souls 3 felt like FromSoft finally found the perfect balance of difficulty, faster paced gameplay with iconic bosses, and rewarding skill expression even more by allowing most bosses to become parryable. And it's okay if you sucked at parrying, because rolling was made far easier in Dark Souls 3 compared to any other game, which was the largest piece of accessibility added onto it. Some of the bosses were a lot more challenging as well. Upon my first playthrough years ago, I remember being stuck on Pontiff for the longest time. I didn't know how to parry back then because I never used a shield, and on top of that, he was pretty aggressive. As far as the lore goes and the place that you meet him in the game, it felt like the perfect spot for him to be, because if you could get past him, then it felt like nothing else could stop you. Pontiff was definitely the most rewarding fight for me, but ultimately resulted in a lower percentage of players completing it when compared to Dark Souls 2, yet still more than Dark Souls 1 and even Elden Ring. Now, here's where the biggest problem arises. Elden Ring, as previously stated, has the lowest completion rate of any Souls game. Normally, this wouldn't be a problem. Elden Ring has some of the hardest bosses of the series so far, as well as the largest playable area required to explore for the game's completion. However, when considering the lesson of accessibility that Miyazaki learned from Sekiro, it shows that Sekiro has the second highest completion rate of the Souls series, which means they at least accomplished and understood how to make their games more accessible. FromSoft also spent the longest time developing this game compared to any others. There was no development hell and there was no shift in directors. Elden Ring was built off the experience experience Miyazaki obtained over the last decade of creating Souls games. Miyazaki believed that Elden Ring would become the most completed game so far, but currently it sits at the lowest game completion percentage. The highest achieved ending was Ronnie's ending, and even that one ending doesn't even surpass Dark Souls 1. However, this game had multiple endings and achievements for each ending, while Dark Souls games had multiple endings but not as many achievements for all of them. Elden Ring expressed its newfound accessibility by allowing the bosses to become harder than ever before, but letting the player have access to an insane amount of tools, such as ignoring them completely and walking around them, and by using a map and waypoint marker for the first time, featuring more total weapons than Dark Souls 1 and 3 combined, an assload of summonable NPCs to help you fight bosses, as well as 64 unique spirit ashes that, when upgraded to max level, could even solo most enemies for you. On top of this, we saw spells and weapons achieving minimum DPS numbers that were considered well past the maximum DPS from previous Souls games. There's so much more damage and defensive stats available for the player, like the physics flask and fingerprint shields, rivers of blood, and pre-nerf bloodhound step, that it seems trivial for the completion rates to be some of the lowest in the series so far. The reasons for such a low completion rate is the world being so vast and open when Dark Souls has always been so linear. Of course, an open world is better, don't get me wrong, but some areas were completely optional, and trying to figure out which area was necessary to progress left players feeling lost or unsure about where to go next. And sure, this could be entirely the player's fault. I personally didn't find the world so confusing to travel through, as it was more exciting to explore every area regardless. But I can see how newer players could get overwhelmed by this fact. And to prove this point, FromSoft had to later add literal map markers on the player's maps because a ton of players didn't realize where to go after certain events like killing Morgott or Radahn. The only time I ever genuinely got lost in Elden Ring was in that area on my first playthrough, when I killed Morgott and got his medallion. I didn't know how to access the fucking elevator where I needed to use it. That big golden door that looks like it should be too big to open manually or large enough to be opened with the lever was sort of hidden off to the side with the expectation that the player would have found it earlier. This is also where we see the highest drop in player percentages between bosses that are required to beat the game. I don't like handholding as much as anyone else, but you can't naturally expect the player to find one specific and vague area required to beat the game in an open world, and the game should guide the player naturally to these same areas instead. I think another major factor for a lower completion rate was that Elden Ring became the most played Souls game of all time. It had the highest player base and the highest copy sold out of any previous Souls game. It achieved an audience like no other, hitting the 6th most played game of all time on Steam alone. The new players that tried playing Elden Ring for the first time were also a majority of the same people that would have never considered touching Dark Souls in the past. Dark Souls honestly had such a negative connotation surrounding its name. I remember asking all my friends to play Dark Souls long before Elden Ring ever came out. All I got was weird looks and responses like, "Isn't that the really hard game?" I don't know, I don't really enjoy difficult games like that. Dark Souls at least knew its audience very well, and vice versa. The audience comprised itself of people who knew the games were hard but enjoyed that about the games anyways. I genuinely believe that one of the largest reasons for Elden Ring's success was that it didn't have Dark Souls in the title. Most people bought into the hype of the standard open world RPG aspect, and yes, while some people knew they were the same developers as Dark Souls, it felt like Elden Ring was seen in a more socially accepted light, especially with the collaboration of George R.R. Martin and removing the linear level design from their equation, and pretty much every streamer and YouTuber on the internet playing it. So many people caught wind of this new game, hoping it would be easier than previous Souls games, only to find out that it wasn't. Sure, it had more tools and resources, but while exploring the open world was supposed to feel like an optional feature, it became more of a requirement to find all the necessary pieces of gear and equipment and hunting down precious upgrade materials. Increasing the charges and efficiency of your flasks, finding good crystal tiers for your physics, upgrade materials like smithing stones and gloveworts seemed a bit tedious when hidden throughout a massive map instead of a linear one. I don't think Elden Ring was too difficult, as I personally enjoyed doing challenge runs where I made the game even harder than normal for myself, but I also have years of experience playing Souls games and understand that when Elden Ring has the largest audience possible, it objectively comes with an influx of players who have never played a Dark Souls game before. This isn't to say that you need to play Dark Souls to be able to beat Elden Ring either, just that the game might feel exceedingly more tedious for someone who doesn't care for the world building and exploration and just wants to play or beat the game, which is the one advantage that linear games have. I believe over time, Elden Ring will have a higher completion rate than Dark Souls 1 and possibly Dark Souls 3, but it's quite interesting to see that what Miyazaki believed to be the most completed Souls game had some of the lowest completion rates so far with the highest number of players in recorded history.